Here in this lecture, we are going to begin talking about background and introduction to Paul's letter to the church in Rome. So near as we can tell, Paul's letter to the church in Rome was written somewhere in the mid to late 50s AD. And we know from the letter itself that Paul is writing the church in Rome from the city of Corinth, which is in Greece. Now, the church in Corinth was one of the churches that Paul himself had founded. And you may remember from your Luke Acts class when you did overview and introduction to the New Testament that the church in Corinth was one of the more troublesome of the churches that Paul founded. In fact, we know that Paul wrote likely 4 different letters to the church in Corinth, of which we have 2 in our New Testament, and the other 2 are lost somewhere in the ashes of history and have never been recovered. Now, Paul's plan when he writes the church in Rome is to introduce himself to the church in Rome, since he did not found the church in Rome and he himself had never been there before. And his plan was to go from Corinth south to Jerusalem and to have a visit in Jerusalem where he is likely dropping off the offering that he has been taking, his collection, from among all of the churches that he himself had founded, to bring that offering to Jerusalem to help with famine relief of the Jewish church in Jerusalem. And his plan was, after visiting the church in Jerusalem, to then go to the church in Rome to introduce himself there, and then his plan was to go from there to the city of Spain, where he himself had never been. Now, what do we know about the church in Rome? Well, the origin of the church in Rome is shrouded in some mystery. There is some early church tradition that the Apostle Peter was the first to share the message of Jesus Christ in the city of Rome, which of course was the capital of the Roman Empire. Now, Paul had never been to the church in Rome, which is why he's writing this letter. And it's likely, if the gospel had first been shared through Peter, that those who came to faith were likely to have been Jewish people who were attracted to the message of Jesus as the promised Messiah. And so it's likely that the earliest church in the city of Rome was comprised mostly, if not exclusively, of Jewish Christians as part of the larger Jewish diaspora that had been scattered outside of Jerusalem and the area of Palestine and were living throughout the Roman Empire. These were likely to be Hellenistic Jewish people who found the message of Jesus attractive and patterned their worship in the city of Rome in houses much after the patterns that we find in Jewish synagogues. Now, we know that ultimately an edict came from the Roman Emperor Claudius that kicked out or expelled all of the Jewish people living in the city of Rome. We don't know exactly why this edict came out. The one explanation we have is from a Roman historian named Suetonius. And Suetonius says that this edict came from the Roman Emperor Claudius that kicked out all of the Jewish people from the city of Rome because of rioting among the Jewish people over a figure named Chrestus. Now, many historians, modern historians, believe that Chrestus is actually a misspelling of the Latinized title Christ, and that the arguing or even rioting among the Jewish people in the city of Rome was over Christ, was over whether Jesus was the promised Christ or promised Messiah or not. That's probably the prevailing theory as to what led to Claudius's edict. Whatever the cause, all of the Jewish people, including the Jewish Christians, were kicked out of the city of Rome for a period of time. And it's likely that after all of the Christians, the Jewish Christians, had been expelled from Rome, that there began to grow a non-Jewish Christian community in Rome. And it's likely that this community grew very rapidly and quickly. And so in the absence of Jewish Christians from Rome, in its place, a non-Jewish Christian community began to grow in Rome, comprised of people from a variety of different ethnicities, perhaps some from Africa, some from Greece, some native to Italy, from throughout the greater Roman world. Now eventually, the Edict of Claudius was revoked, and Jewish people were permitted to return to the city of Rome. And it's likely when this happened that the Jewish Christians who had left Rome came back to their home city and found that there was a vibrant, growing, non-Jewish Christian community in its place that had grown in their absence. These non-Jewish Christians likely worshipped in very different ways than Jewish Christians worshipped. They worshipped in different language. They probably did not observe the Jewish dietary laws. They probably worshipped on Sunday instead of on the Jewish Sabbath, and so on and so forth. And so it's likely that there was a significant amount of tension between the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians in the city of Rome. Now let's talk a little bit about why Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. The purpose for this letter. Like the book of Galatians, the book of Romans is likely an occasional letter. It's occasioned by a particular or set of particular circumstances. So let me give you a couple of theories as to the purpose of Romans. I'll start with Martin Luther's theory. Martin Luther believed the book of Romans was written as a doctrinal summary of the gospel. In other words, Paul wrote the book of Romans to summarize everything that he found to be important in his message or in his gospel. So that was Martin Luther's view, and so of course this greatly impacted Protestantism that grew out of Luther's protests and the Protestant Reformation. T.W. Manson, a New Testament scholar, his view is that the purpose of Romans is that Romans is a summary of Paul's gospel, similar to what Luther says, but that the reason he writes a summary of his gospel was to introduce himself to the church in Rome and to ask their support and partnership for his mission to Spain. In other words, Paul is writing the book of Romans as a kind of pre-fundraising letter to the church in Rome in order to summarize his message in hopes that they will join in partnership in sending him to his mission in Spain. Another New Testament scholar, Gunther Bornkamm, a German scholar, claims that Romans is Paul's last will and testament. In other words, it's his final statement of his ministry and of his message. G. Klein, another New Testament scholar, says that Romans is Paul's effort to give the church in Rome an apostolic foundation, since he believes one is lacking. Since the church in Rome was not